Here we go. So fuse jumped around on me there. Okay. My name is Jim Pingle, and I'll be doing this January 2015 Hangout on server load balancing and failover, primarily focusing on load balancing, but the good thing about load balancing and what I'm going to be going over is that load balancing also buys you failover. So win-win. All right, first up, a few notes about the project. Unless you've been living under a rock, you probably know that we've released pfSense 2.2. Now, there have been some issues with it that impact a few people. Be very sure that if you're going to upgrade, you read the blog post, release notes, the upgrade guide. Basically, do your homework to make sure that none of the issues are going to affect you. We do have a 2.2.1 release following it up to fix a couple of things, but just by the nature of the beast with the gigantic base operating system upgrade we did, some things are going to react a little bit different depending on your hardware. The forum's a good place to look as well. But for most people, it's been pretty good, aside from a couple of rough edges, and we're seeing a pretty big uptake on it so far. In other news, we have started some online training through our pfSense University. Last year, we did a couple of in-person classes. We're expanding that out and doing a lot more online training this year. There's a blog post about it. You can follow the link here in the presentation, or go after just go to blog.pfsense.org. It's just a couple of posts down. It's a 2-day course. There's a fundamentals course the first day, and then a second day for advanced. The advanced part is optional, but if you want the advanced, you have to take the fundamentals course. So you don't have to take day 2, but if you want day 2, you got to take day 1. There's some introductory prices with discounts on the blog post, and I think a lot of the classes have filled up, but if you try to sign up and it doesn't let you use the discount code, then the class is full. But we're adding classes all the time. I think they've planned several more classes. We just don't have them up on the schedule officially yet. In other news, I'm not sure if anybody's kept a good eye on it, except for me, but been doing a lot of really major updates to the wiki. Brought a lot of the articles and content up to date, cleaned up some older stuff, put a bunch of new articles up, and there's still a lot more to come there. But for the most part, it's up to date for 2.2 in a lot of cases, and maybe 2.15 in some others. But it's all good and current. So if you had been ignoring the wiki, thinking it was out of date or didn't have a lot of info, it's time to take another look. All right. In this Hangout for this month, I'm going to be focusing on server load balancing and failover using both the built-in load balancer, RealAD, and an add-on package, HFProxy. I don't know if you say it HFProxy, HFProxy, whatever. I will just say HFProxy just because that's what I'm familiar with. There are several other packages out there that will do reverse proxying like this, like a Squid 3 reverse and Apache proxy mod security, things like that. They are not quite as easy to get going as HFProxy, and at least in my experience, I haven't had as much luck with them being stable and easy to use. So primary choices here are RealAD and HFProxy. I'm going to go over a bunch of the advantages and disadvantages, when you'd want to use each one, basically. I am going to assume that you've already got some web servers up and running in place, including DNS entries. I'm not going to cover that part. And this is going to be a practical example demonstrated, as you might be able to see over on the right-hand side of the screen. The demonstration system I've got set up here, I actually have both of them running at once, just on different external ports. So I've got RealAD set up, and I've also got HFProxy set up. And so it'll be a good practical demonstration. I am only going to be covering HTTP, not HTTPS. We might do a follow-up with some others like SSL offloading and things down the road. But for today, I'm just going to get started on the basics. A little bit of a comparison we'll be going into here. RealAD is built into pfSense. It's under Services and Load Balancer. It's originally from OpenBSD, but it was ported to FreeBSD. It's meant to work with PF directly, and it's mostly meant for simple services and specific tasks. basically, if you're just getting started, you've just got a couple of servers you want to load balance. It's good for that. If you need some more advanced features, it's time to move up to something like HFProxy. HFProxy is an add-on package for pfSense, which, like all other packages, you can install it from System and Packages on the Available Packages tab. It's very powerful, very flexible. It's actually a true proxy, whereas RealAD basically uses NAT, but I'll get to that in a minute. HFProxy has a lot more capabilities, but it does use more resources, so there's a little bit more overhead involved with it. But for most deployments that need it, it is well worth the extra. In terms of how they operate, RealAD works like NAT and uses PF. It's more like a super port forward. The RealAD daemon will track the servers on the back end and add and remove them from basically a port forward as needed and passes them through that way. In comparison, HFProxy is a true proxy, which means that the client connection coming from the outside actually terminates the connection to HFProxy, and then HFProxy makes a new connection back to the server, whereas RealAD, the original connection is completely end-to-end client to server. It doesn't get intercepted like it does with the true proxy. For connection handling, RealAD does not inspect the contents of the packets. It just forwards based on the headers. So it sees your destination IP and port, says, oh, that matches my virtual server, that goes over to these guys, just like a port forward does. HFProxy can actually look inside the request and can act on headers or other information. It can actually inject cookies, things like that. And one thing that HFProxy can do that RealAD can't is HFProxy is capable of matching on a host header and directing different requests to different backend servers based on the host header. So you could sort of use it to overload your sites, multiple sites on one IP address with different backend servers, not just with virtual hosts. For the service types, they both can handle arbitrary services, so you really can't, you can do a lot more than just HTTP and HTTPS. You could load balance mail servers, MySQL servers, IMAP, really whatever you need to load balance. If it's a TCP service, you can load balance it with either one. As long as your servers on the back end have access to the same accounts and content or data and everything. So it's really good for spreading the load around in a cluster-like behavior for pretty much any service you can come up with. So they're similar in that regard. However, HFProxy especially is geared toward HTTP and HTTPS. Most of the options in the web interface for it are geared toward that. However, those a lot of things can just simply be glossed over, ignored, whatever. If you're going to if you're using some other type of service. Now, for the client addresses, like when the client connects through, with RealAD, it passes through the original connection, so the client IP is intact when it reaches the server. So in your server access logs, you'll see that the actual client address is there. However, by default in HFProxy, because it's a true proxy, in your web server logs, it would show the IP address of your firewall or the HFProxy server because it has proxied that connection. The client goes to HFProxy and HFProxy goes back to your server. There's a couple ways around that. HFProxy can put in a forwarded for header, and that can be used by the web server. I've got a link there to how you can actually get that in the Apache logs. In PHP and other languages, they also have access to that via a server environment variable, so they can see the true client address if they need to log or act on that. And as an alternative, there is a mode in the HFProxy devel package, which is what I'm going to be demonstrating here, that is called transparent client IP, and it works like RealAD, where it attempts to pass through the actual client address. So that's what the server behind you will see, and that can be used in a lot of different cases as well. So it sort of sidesteps that need to monkey with the logs or additional programming to get the original client address. In terms of reporting, RealAD really only tracks the up-down status and uptime percentages. It doesn't really give you any detailed usage statistics about the load on any of these servers or give you any kind of metrics that you can use to determine, how useful the load balancing is, that sort of stuff. HFProxy will give you more statistics than you ever wanted to know about these requests, which we'll show you the stats here in a little bit. For reliability, as far as that goes, for more than basic or simple tasks, RealAD is just not that good. It can handle things okay, but if you put any sort of significant burden on it, it's just not going to be able to handle it really well. It's just not meant for that. And so if you're using RealAD and you find that, oh, well, I'm having issues, it's marking my servers down when they shouldn't be down, it's not balancing right, things like that, it's probably time to upgrade to HFProxy and ditch the RealAD. But for a lot of really basic stuff, it works just fine, and it's super simple. But as you'll see here in this demonstration too, in terms of configuring the two of them, there are a lot more options in HFProxy, but honestly, it's not that much more complicated to get going than RealAD. So it's really good options here. HFProxy is a lot more robust and reliable. It does consume more resources, but as I mentioned earlier, in the vast majority of the time it's necessary, it's well worth the extra expenditure on resources. A little bit of extra RAM, depending on which options you activate and how many connections you need to handle, but and if you're doing like SSL offloading, it might take a bit more CPU time on the firewall. But again, depending on your resources that you've got and what you really need to do, it's usually well worth the trade-off. For the service and daemon binding, because RealAD works like NAT, there is no binding actually involved. It sets up basically, like I said earlier, like a port forward, and it just accepts the requests to that external. Well, it doesn't actually accept a request. It just sees that request coming to the external IP port and relays that connection in. So it doesn't actually need to bind to anything. You would still need a virtual IP address in cases where you would need that, especially with NAT. But it could be a proxy ARP IP. It doesn't have, or it doesn't actually have to be a true IP like an IP alias or CARP where it would bind. On the other hand, HFProxy actually does bind, so you would need to make sure that not just the IP address is available, but also the port number. So if you are using the web GUI on port 443 or some other port, and this redirect is enabled, you will need to disable the redirect so that port 80 will be freed up. And if you intend to use HFProxy on port 443 and you use HTTPS for the GUI, you will need to move the GUI to an alternate port. Since I'm only covering HTTP today, I left this alone. Now, for balancing methods, RealAD, at least on pfSense, the way we have it set up, you can only do round robin, where it goes, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It's really, really basic. However, with HFProxy, you can do 2 different round robin styles, or it can do a least connection style or a source hash style, which I'll explain all those when we get deeper into the HFProxy configuration. In terms of client-server relationships, say you've got a web app that really needs to make sure that the same client always goes to the same server. RealAD tends to have issues with that. There's a sticky connections option that's supposed to help, but we've seen various issues with that over the past, whether it really effectively nullifies load balancing or it just isn't maintained long-term. There have been issues with that in the past. If you require that, you're better off going straight to HFProxy. And HFProxy can maintain that client-server relationship several ways, but the easiest way is by doing a cookie value. For example, if you've got a PHP web app that you're dealing with, you can key off the PHP session ID, and it will see that cookie coming through in the request and make sure that they always return back to that server, or the source hash where it goes based off the source address. Now, SSL offloading I mentioned briefly earlier. That's where if the client makes an SSL connection to HFProxy actually handles the SSL certificates and everything there. And then on the back end, it can just be plain HTTP back to the actual web servers, essentially removing that SSL burden from your web servers and placing it on the firewall. That's a blessing and a curse in that it may simplify some things on your web servers, but it puts a lot higher CPU burden on the firewall. If you need to do that, HFProxy is the only one that's going to do that for you. RealAD can't do that. Can't get even close. All it does is just relay connections. All right, a little bit about my demo environment that I've got for today. Obviously, as I mentioned, I'm going to do both RealAD and HFProxy. I've got one firewall in front to act as a load balancer. I've got 3 web servers. The WAN address of the firewall is, in this case, 192.168.20.74, and the LAN servers are 10.42.42.11, 12, and 13. That's server 1, server 2, and server 3. They are identical FreeBSD web servers. They've all just got a simple page that, it differs, just because for test purposes, just to show you which server you connect to. I have some DNS entries set up to put, www.example.com to resolve that to my WAN address, and I've got a couple other test hosts set up, but I'm probably not going to have time to get into those today. They, basically all resolve back there just to have for a proof of concept. I've got a test web client on the LAN or on the WAN side, on the outside here. That's this web browser. And the virtual server for RealAD is going to be on port 8080 and HFProxy on 80. Normally these would both be on 80 or 443, but just because I wanted to show both of them at once, I put them on different ports. And also it's a good demonstration to show you can use both at the same time if you have to on different IPs and ports. Okay, well, quite an intro, but now we're off to our example RealAD setup. There is a walkthrough available on the wiki, more or less about the same detail I'm going to go into here, though maybe not as much of a practical example. Before you set up the servers, we're going to configure the monitors. I'm going to scoot this down a little bit just so you can see both at once. We are going to go here to Services and Load Balancer, over here to the Monitors tab. And you'll see there are several different monitors that we have here. For this one, I'm just going to be using a generic HTTP monitor. You can make a custom HTTP monitor that actually queries a specific path or host. Some people prefer that to be a static image or something that's a piece of static content just to test the web server. Some people point that at a specific script that might do a simple database query so that they can get some assurance that both the web server is responding okay, that their language of choice is working, and that their database is up and running. So if you have a custom script that will just run a simple test like that and would return an error code otherwise, you could point it at that, or like I said, some people like a piece of static content. Whichever one you use, that's really up to you. Or you can just use this generic one that just tests the root. So before you do anything else, get your monitor set up and make sure your servers are actually online and operational. I've got, I'll just show you one of them. I've got it. Just show you that I've got Apache 24 or 2.4 running on there, and it's running already. Everything's up. And that one's ready to go. And first things first, you define your load balancing pool, which is the actual web servers that are going to be listening for content, or that are going to be providing the content, rather. The name here at the top, it's got to be something pretty simple. The same sort of restrictions apply here that would apply to an alias. Basically, no special funky characters. I think you can use underscore, but not dashes. Can't be just a number. It's got to be less than 32 letters, that sort of thing. As you can see, I have done load balance mode. There's another mode for manual failover. We're not really going to get into that because it's not automatic, so it's not really that useful. The description there for my web servers is just something I typed in. You can be whatever you want, free form. Port 80 and that's because the actual web server processes on these servers are going to be listening on port 80. And they do all have to be listening on the same port. So if you've got 3 servers, they all have to be listening on port 80. That's another restriction HFProxy doesn't have. And retry for this, I put in 5. That's the default. That's how many times that a monitor would have to fail in a row in order for the server to be flagged as down. And so we've got our monitor as HTTP. If you have a custom one, it'll be in this list. You can choose it. You just punch in the IP for one of your servers, click add, do the next one, click add, and then a third one or whatever, and click add. They'll end up down here on the enabled side. If you need to manually remove one from a pool temporarily, say you want to do maintenance on your second server, you can move it over into the disabled side if you want, but that's all up to you. There's a couple other ways you can disable them. We'll get to those in a moment as well. All right, so all those are, so now that I've got my pool set up, you can see it here. My servers, load balance, it's got my server IPs, everything looks good. This one's going to be for load balance. If you want to do a failover, you could have a separate pool here with a 4th server or an additional server that just hosts a static web page that says, you know, our site's down, under maintenance, whatever. And then you could call it your fallback pool. And then in a moment when we do the virtual server, you can set that up. So if you need more pools, you set them all up here. And then we move on to handling the virtual server. Now the virtual server is the front end, the public-facing side of your load balancer. And so at the top you'll see I just put a name, same restrictions as the pool. You know, it's got to be, you know, fairly short, 32 letters or less, and no special characters. More of a free-form description. And then the IP address, which in this case I put the WAN IP, but it could be any, you know, virtual IP address or other IP you've got available. And and this is going to be where the clients actually connect to. So like in your, whatever your DNS resolves to, you know, that's the IP you're going to want to bind this to. And port 80 is the public-facing port that they're going to reach. You know, it's, you know, 80 for HTTP, 443 for HTTPS, and so on. In this case, I did 8080 just for my example, as I mentioned, so we can have this and HFProxy coexist. For the virtual server pool, all of your pools will show up in this list, and I just click that one because I've got it. If you just have one pool, don't bother with the fallback pool. However, if you have your fallback pool, you can choose it there, and that will come into play if all of the virtual servers are down. It will serve from the fallback pool instead. And relay protocol, leave that on TCP. There is a DNS protocol you can use to load balance DNS servers specifically, but that's a story for another time. Basically, you can load balance DNS with that because it handles it specially because it's DNS is a bit of a hybrid between TCP and UDP. It requires special handling. So we got that all in place. Press save there or submit. And now we've got both our virtual server and our pool. Take a visit over here onto the settings tab. The timeout in milliseconds there is how long a check will have to wait to time out. So this basically here is 1 second. So, you know, a second after the check is made, if it fails, you know, then that check is marked as failed. Interval is how long between the checks, and here's 10 seconds between checks. So if we do a little bit of math, the interval's, you know, 10 seconds. We had 5 retries and 1 second to fail, so it could be just about a minute before we notice this is down. Probably not ideal for it to be down that long, so you might want to reduce those from the defaults, but it's really up to you. If you have really busy or overloaded servers that miss health checks a lot, even though they're working fine, you might need to increase that instead of decreasing. If you need something to be a little bit more responsive and you know the servers are fast, then you can decrease it. The pre-fork here is only used for the DNS load balancer, so we'll leave that blank since we're not going to bother with it today. Now, when you make firewall rules for RealAD, keep in mind that it is like a port forward, and the NAT process happens before the firewall rules. So when you make your firewall rules for RealAD, they are targeting the pool, not the virtual server. So here our firewall rule to pass through RealAD is just a TCP protocol. Our destination is an alias that contains our web servers. As you can see, the private addresses, the 1042.42s, 11, 12, and 13, and port 80, which is the port that our pool servers are listening on. And using an alias like this with your web servers, it speeds the process up significantly. Otherwise, you need 3 separate rules, or a rule for each individual web server, which isn't ideal. So just make an alias and off you go. All right. And another note here too, if you have clients on the same LAN with the servers, you cannot reach them without some extra work. Because RealAD preserves the client address, when the servers see that, they will just try to bypass everything and just talk right back to the client, which isn't ideal. You don't really want that. So what you need here is a little bit of Outbound NAT, which you would need to be back here on either manual Outbound NAT entirely, or in 2.2 you can use our hybrid Outbound NAT, which keeps your automatic rules but lets you do a mapping on top of that. Actually, this should, all right, when you make a rule, it should be interface on the LAN, because that's where your clients are coming from. That's where the traffic's going to exit. This really could be TCP. And then, you know, our local client is going to be a 1042.42. Let's just say 0/24. Destination. I'm just reusing this old rule here. 42. Actually, this could be your web servers. Destination port 80 interface. And then we could make this Outbound NAT for RealAD. Help if I could type. RealAD reflection. And what that would let us do is the client request going to the RealAD out on the outside will hit that and bounce back toward the server. As that connection goes back to the server, leaving the firewall, this NAT will translate it so it looks like it came from the firewall itself. Now, the server will see the firewall's IP and return that traffic back to the firewall, where it will go back through NAT and come back naturally to the client, and everything will work just fine. So that's a good way to get your clients and servers to coexist in the same LAN if they have to. We really strongly recommend keeping your servers off in a DMZ or somewhere separate. But a lot of times we acknowledge, you know, that's not really a viable thing for some people, and they really need to keep things together. So, you know, in that case, you do need the NAT. Downside of that is that your server will not see the true client address in that case. You know, there's not really a good solution for that locally, because of the way the NAT and everything works. There's just really not a good way around that in the RealAD case, because, you know, it's really a limitation of how networking is going to work when both the servers and the clients are in the same subnet, and you also need load balancing. If it was a simple web server, you could do split DNS and just come in locally, but in this case with RealAD, you can't really do that without losing your load balancing. So it's kind of a trade-off, but, you know, ideally you just move the servers off to another interface and everything works just fine without any hoop jumping. All right, now that we got all that in place, let's go over here to status and load balancer. And you can see that all 3 of our servers are up and running. Here's another place where you could manually remove a server from the pool. Say you want to do maintenance on server number 2, you just uncheck this. Nope. Hello? Looks like it stopped my screen share. Hold on. Can anybody hear me? Hello? Sorry, I lost me there. Let me get this going again. All right, sorry about that. Can you hear me? Well, I'm not sure what happened there, but I got disconnected. Give me just a second to get everything situated again. Okay, now where was I? I was doing the status of our load balancer here under status and load balancer. Here on the pools tab, you can see the status of the servers is all up in green. And if you want to take one of these guys out of the pool, you can just uncheck the box and hit save, and that will essentially, just like moving it around in the pool configuration, it'll take that one out of service. And we can go over here on the virtual servers tab, and you can see where it's showing us the servers that are in the pool, where it's going on the public side of things. And the status is active, and how many sessions are there, and it gives you just some really basic information. Now, if you want to test this over here, we recommend using private browsing mode to test it, just so it doesn't keep cookies or anything else. I loaded this guy up, says, hello, my name is server number 3. It shows me my session ID. Now, if I hold shift and reload, I get server 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So every time I hold shift and reload, I'm getting a different server. And obviously the cookie stays the same because it's coming from the client, going to the same web, what it believes is the same web server. So you got server 3 again. If I hold shift and reload, bam, I'm back to server number 1, and off we go. So when you're testing, just make sure you use private browsing mode, close your browser, open it back up, or shift reload, control F5, those sorts of things. And that's it for RealAD. I mean, that's really all there is to it. And as you'll see with HFProxy, it's not that much more involved either. I already showed you how to disable that port 80 redirect earlier. We just need to make sure that's off since we're going to use port 80. And a reminder, if HFProxy is going to use the same port as the GUI, you need to move that to another port because the GUI binds to that port on all addresses of the firewall, which would prevent HFProxy from getting that address. And so in this case, we're just doing HTTP on port 80, so disabling the redirect was sufficient. And then you need to install the HFProxy package. If we go here to System Packages, it would show up on the Available Packages tab. As you can see here, I've already got it installed. I am using the HFProxy devel package. It really, aside from the name, it's stable. We just need to get it renamed over to HFProxy. On 2.2, it's the only option. And on 2.1.5, it's really the best one to use, even though it says devel. It's just a matter of getting that synced over to the main HFProxy package. And then, the devel might, take off on some other direction. But for the moment, it's the one to use. It's the one we recommend, just because of the features it has. And it's a lot newer version of HFProxy, and it can do a lot more with SSL than the other ones can. So like we had, let's go to services and HFProxy, which will show up after the package is installed. And now, just like with RealAD, we need a backend, or it's called a backend in HFProxy, which is analogous to a pool in RealAD. And you can hit plus to add a new one, just like there. Or I'm going to hit edit here. Name, I just called it My Web Servers. The server list here, as you can see, I've got if you hit plus, you'll have the same options here. My mode is active, or you could have some other states here if you like. This is just a simple name for the server. I just use server 1, 2, and 3. Use address and port for that. And here's the actual IP address of the web server. And then the port it's listening on, which can be different for each one if you want to. Checkbox saying whether or not that's doing SSL. And a wait. because you can do weighted balancing in HFProxy. So if you want to, if you've got 3 servers and one of them is really powerful, the other 2 aren't so much, you could weight it so that more connections go to the more powerful server if you like. And here, the various modes we talked about earlier, round robin and static round robin are similar, except for the way that the calculations are done. With round robin, it's basically like round robin in RealAD, where it just goes server 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, but it is weight balanced. It's dynamic, and so as servers come and go, it can adapt to those. But because it's so dynamic, it can also be a little bit slower to respond to changes. And with static round robin, things are calculated at the beginning, and so like weights and things, they won't change on the fly. Now, least connections is a good one too. Say you've got 3 web servers, and it just happens that your client load, for whatever reason, long sessions or whatever, gets imbalanced, where one server ends up with a lot more, and you don't want it that way. Least connections will direct new connections to whichever server has the lowest connection count, so that it's always trying to even it out a little bit better, which is probably what a lot of people would really prefer. In a lot of cases, except it's really up to you. And source does source hashing to make sure that it does balance like the others, but the source IP is hashed so that a client-server relationship is maintained based on the source address that they're coming through, which is good if if the client addresses don't change and you need to maintain those sessions. Here's the transparent client IP option I mentioned earlier that lets you pass through the true client address back to your web servers. In this particular case, I'm not going to activate that, but you can if you like. Really, I've used this in production a couple of different places for people, and it's really made them happy. It's been fine. I've not had any issues with it. However, it can interfere with captive portal and maybe limiters, other things that use IPFW rules, because it's how that accomplishes the task. So it's really matter of preference and what you want to see in your web server logs, but personally, I would not hesitate to activate it, except in this case, I'm just doing a simple demo and I didn't need it. There's some other, if you know your way around HFProxy, just not in the pfSense GUI, if you know there's some options that we don't have that you want to add in, you can use these pass-through boxes to pass advanced configurations into HFProxy. For health checking, similar to RealAD, I'm just going to use a plain HTTP check. There are checks in here you see for LDAP, MySQL, Redis, Postgres, SMTP, and others. So really, you can have it check whatever you want to do. You can put in a different check frequency. It defaults to once per second. You can even log the checks if you want. Right now, I have it doing an HTTP options query. It's just a simple query that would let the web server respond. You could do head, get, post, put, pretty much anything you really can come up with. Some people might prefer one option over another based on what they do or don't want to see on their web server logs or what their server is configured to handle, or what type of query they want to check and make sure it works. Some people might want to check and make sure they can always put through a specific post query. So. These advanced settings like connection timeout, server timeout, and retries, similar to what we had in RealAD. You can they're described pretty in depth in here. You can do cookie-based persistence or stick table persistence. Cookie persistence actually has HFProxy injecting a cookie into the connection. Stick table is a little bit easier from my point of view. It will just look at a cookie that's already passing through and let you go on here. As you can see, I did a stick table or a stick cookie PHP sesh ID. Sorry. Ignore what it has here. That's not the right name. That needs to be corrected in the GUI. It actually is PHP sesh ID, SESSID, right there. Length of 64 is just, it's about what you need for that. I just did a 3-hour session. If you have longer user sessions, you can make it longer. And I used 100K for the stick table size. You could make that a lot more, a lot less. It's, depends on the amount of RAM you've got and how many clients you actually expect to pass through. The stats enabled, you don't really need to worry about this in most cases now because HFProxy the package currently has an internal page that will show it to you. But if you want to enable a specific URL to get stats just for this particular server, you can if you fill in the options there. And you can set up a custom error page if you want. Not going to get into that one today either. So after all that, just click save, and bam, now you've got your backend. So now we need to go back to services and HFProxy, and now we need a front end, which is just like a RealAD virtual server. Now you can add a new one, and then in this case, I've already got this one here, so I'll just edit it and show it to you. The name, this is just my website. Status, I do active. For the external address, I'm just having this bind right to the WAN address, which in HFProxy, it can track a dynamic IP address, which is something that you can't do in RealAD as well. You could have it listen on a specific VIP or others, or you could just put in a custom address and enter in whatever you want. I've got this running on port 80, and that's all I needed to set up for this one. We're not doing SSL offloading, so we don't need that. And here we go, backend server pool. We just put in our web server pool. And for the type, I did HTTP. There's some additional logging options down here if you want to log things a little bit more detail. Don't really need to do that in most environments, but if you're having some issues, you can always have it increase your logging more. I have this option use forward for set, so it will add the option I mentioned earlier, the X forwarded for header to the request. So it will actually pass on the true client address in the HTTP headers back to the web server. Now the way this works, it can't do keep alive, which might be another undesirable outcome for using this option. So you want to put this HTTP close on HTTP close here. That way every request gets terminated, and then every request will get a valid X forwarded for header. Otherwise, only the first request would have the forwarded for header, and the other requests that come through on the same connection wouldn't have the right headers, so you might lose something in the logs. All right, with that done, go ahead and save. And now go back over here to the global settings tab of HFProxy, or just settings. And here, obviously, we need to check this top box to enable. And your maximum connections, I put 1,000 per backend. This is just a sample. I probably could have got by with 5. But you really just need to size this based on how many connections you're going to expect per backend. And there's a handy table over here on the right-hand side that shows you about how much RAM you'll need for a specific amount of connections. If you need to tweak it, you can actually have it start more processes, things like that. You can do CARP monitoring so that it would only run on whichever, the package would only run on whichever CARP node was the primary or the master node, not the backup. Not going to worry about that one today. The internal stats port, the default's 2200. That's what I put on there. That's fine. If you have that port in use by something else, you could put a different port there. I'm not doing remote syslogging here today, but you could fill in a remote syslog server so that the logs will go straight to the remote server and not the local logs. There's some other options here you might want to set. Again, a pass-through if you need to pass stuff through. If you're using SSL, you might need to have it recalculate some certificates. If you're in a CARP HA pair, you could have this synchronize settings over to your other members as well. So all that's done, you can click save. There's a link down here at the bottom to see the actual HFProxy configuration if you're curious. But once you click save, then bam, all you got to do is come over and point it at your web server. And as you can see here, even though I'm clicking Shift F5 and refreshing, I'm always going back to the same server. And that is because I was using the cookie-based persistence. As you can see, I've got the session ID and it's staying the same. And you can also see here that we've got our X forwarded for header in the output of the server variables, which is good. Now, if we pop open a private browsing window to get a new session and go to our example.com, we're still on server 2, but with a different session. So if I close that out, new private window, example.com. Oh, now I'm on server 3. And refresh, I'm still on server 3. Shift reload, I'm still on server 3. So it does balance, but it does so in a way that maintains your client-server relationship, which is really important for a lot of web applications. So if we go over here and look at our stats tab, you can see here from RealAD or from HFProxy, you get gobs of statistics. You can see your health check output over here. It shows you the last check and what the response was. It's got your server weights, whether or not they're active. Shows you how many bytes were transferred from each web server, how many requests were handled, sessions and everything, rates and all sorts of other fun statistics. And like RealAD, you can check one of these guys and take it out of service, or you could force it up, force it down, set its other thing, or set other variables here, or you can kill all the connections that are going to it. So really, really handy stuff here. And this can be viewed here in the Stats tab, or if you click Stats FS, it's full screen. It will just take over your whole browser window. And that's all there really is to it for either one of them. So just open it up for questions. If anybody had any questions about how either RealAD or HFProxy would work. You can either send it, make sure you send it to the one marked moderator, or you could do the GMP test if it won't let you chat to everybody. I'm not seeing any questions just yet. I'm thinking I might eventually do a follow-up hangout on this where we go over more on HFProxy, maybe SSL offloading, or more of the ACL type things where you redirect things to different web servers based on host names, that kind of fun stuff. Any way to do multiple ports, such as port 4000 goes to the pool on 4000, 4001 goes to 4001 without doing multiple load balancers? Not that I'm aware of. Sorry, Aaron. I think you do have to have a separate one for each one. I don't think there's a way to automate that. At least not with RealAD or HFProxy that I'm aware of. Christoph to everyone, what if the firewall is failing? Can I set up a second firewall, both with HFProxy functionality? Yeah, you could do that with CARP. Our HA function built in. You could have the two nodes, they could both be running HFProxy, and they could bind that to a CARP VIP on the outside. And then, if the primary failed, the secondary would take over. The important thing you'd have to worry about there is making sure the same address was being used on the outside for both things, unless you have a very low DNS TTL, and you could handle it that way to switch it over to a different IP. But using a CARP cluster or an HA cluster for that is the best thing. See, Calvin's asking, is there a lot of load when using HFProxy to inspect the payloads to reject access to specific URLs, for example, across the data center, maybe using HFProxy as a transparent proxy via PF? I have never seen it used like that, and I haven't seen any measurable load, but I haven't seen that particular configuration, so I'm not 100% sure. That's something if you might want to ask on the forum. The HFProxy package maintainer may have some more insight there. All right, anybody else? Anybody else? All right. Okay, well, if there aren't any other questions, I guess we can wrap up. If you have any ideas for future Hangouts, post them on the forum, comment on the blog post. There's Reddit, Twitter, however you want to get them to us, you can get them to us. But that's it for today. We'll obviously have another Hangout next month. There's still a couple that we skipped we need to make up for. We will get back on those. We might do a few just that are just plain Q&A sessions, not like troubleshoot your stuff, but like if you have questions on how things work, we might do a short couple of sessions or two on just basically a grab bag full of stuff. But if you have any ideas about that stuff, just drop us a line, and we're always open to suggestions. Thank you for attending, and hope to see you next month. Bye.